Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, Channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty, at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, the sharing economy provides for the decentralization and privatization of regulation, but the city of Wichita is still clinging to the old ways. Well, in May, the Wichita Eagle printed a letter from a Wichitan describing his recent cab ride home from the airport. The letter said, "I got in the cab to go home, and that turned out to be the most offensive encounter of my trip. The driver was dressed perfectly for slopping hogs. The cab plainly stank. There were spills, trash, crumbs, scuzzy windows, sticky door panels. Ugh." Well, I haven't been in a taxi cab in Wichita for quite a while, but I was surprised to learn of this person's experience. There is a law, after all. The Wichita Municipal Code provides that any vehicle used as a taxi cab shall be kept clean and of good appearance. There's also a mandate that no taxicab driver shall fail to maintain their personal appearance by being neat and clean in dress and person. Also, no driver shall fail to keep clothing in good repair, free of rips, tears, and stains, or operate any taxicab which is not in a clean or sanitary condition. Now, these laws were implemented in 2012 as a result of former Mayor Carl Brewer's frustration with the complaints he received regarding Wichita taxicabs. And the instinct of politicians and bureaucrats is that if there is a problem, a newer, tougher law can provide the solution. And these regulations I mentioned above are part of the city's solution, as are mandatory customer service training classes for taxicab drivers. But as we learned from May of this year, these regulations don't appear to be working, according to at least one person whose judgment the Wichita Eagle trusted enough to print. Now, at the time, the city's actions in creating tougher regulations had a whiff of plausibility, even feasibility. But right about the time that Wichita implemented new regulations, the market for personal rides started to change. That change was the increasing popularity, availability, and refinement of Uber and other similar services. Uber started operating in Wichita in August of 2014. Now, what is different about Uber from regular taxicabs? Well, for one, drivers are rated each time they serve a passenger, and passengers are rated too by the drivers. Now, which form of regulation do you suppose is most effective? Regulation by government or regulation by consumers? The letter in the Wichita Eagle tells of the failure of government regulation. But no one except that passenger likely knows how bad was the experience of riding in that cab. Well, that passenger and the driver's other passengers probably, because a cab doesn't get that grungy in just one day. But a bad Uber trip contributes to the driver's public reputation, and bad passengers also develop a reputation that Uber drivers can see. This is a powerful system of regulation of each and every time service is provided. Well, further evidence of the failure of the city's laws and regulations, at least the city's application and enforcement of them, is that the letter writer begged of the city to pass laws to fix the problem. He wrote, "Wichita, please enact standards for dress, cleanliness, and vehicle condition to protect our reputation. Don't let the impression of the nation's best airport be sullied by taxicabs." Now, you know how when people are frustrated with something, they say, there ought to be a law. Well, there is a law in Wichita. I mentioned some of the highlights earlier. And this law also mandates that taxi drivers take a course in customer service taught by bureaucrats at the city's Convention and Tourism Bureau. And the city has a taxicab enforcement officer. So there is a law, but it doesn't seem to be working. Well, last week, the author Jeffrey Tucker appeared on Wichita Liberty TV. And as we talked about Uber and other services in the sharing economy, I mentioned that this is the decentralization of regulation. Tucker repeated the idea, calling it the privatization of regulation. Both terms apply. But Wichita's 2012 taxicab regulations are still the law. And as the Wichita Eagle recently reported, drivers are still being trained by bureaucrats. But the cabs in Wichita are still dirty and the drivers still slovenly. It seems to me that the Wichita regulations are contrary to how Uber operates, leaving that company operating in the shadows and vulnerable to a clampdown at any time. That is something the city needs to change. Well, when a problem is noticed, often people look to government for a solution. And government bureaucrats are usually eager to produce new laws and regulations in response. And why not? The more laws and regulation on the books, the greater the power in the hands of bureaucrats. In response to a problem in Old Town, the city passed new laws and regulations last year. And to be able to control the behavior of Wichitans with fine granularity, the ordinance contains definitions of art, fine art, and art gallery. Now, did you know that a capacity of a coffee shop cannot be over 100 people? And did you know that an entertainment establishment, well, that's not a place that holds book readings and storytelling? Well, that's what the city says anyway. These are the things that we pay politicians and bureaucrats to fuss over. In 2012, the Wichita City Council also created regulations regarding the licensing and regulating the painting of stripes in parking lots. How, may I ask, has civilization advanced without these types of regulations? These licensure requirements in the Wichita Ordinance states any person or entity, whether as principal, agent, or employee, engaged in the business of striping a parking lot in the city of Wichita shall be required to obtain a striping contractor's license from the city engineer's office. Before receiving such a license, applications must post a surety bond of $5,000 approved by the city attorney. Then the contractor must pass a comprehensive exam on ADA standards for accessible parking. There's an application fee of $100, which appears to be payable annually, and the ordinance is open-ended. It says the city's engineer's office may develop any additional rules and regulations necessary for the issuance or annual renewal of striping contractors' licenses. And to top it off, it appears that these regulations are part of a settlement agreed to by the city of Wichita in response to a lawsuit filed against the city. That's right. The city had problems with the way it painted stripes in its own parking lots. And now, because of the city's sins, we all have to suffer with these needless and overbearing regulations. Well, back to taxicabs for a moment. A poor customer experience is unfortunate, but that does not compare in any way to the ordeal one recent taxicab passenger in Wichita experienced. Through the city's mistake, a mistake the city admitted, a registered sex offender was granted a taxi driver license, and he raped a passenger. Until the city gets big and important things right, like not granting taxicab driver licenses to convicted sex offenders, I don't think the city has earned the right to regulate anything about taxicabs. Public safety is one of the few things we have the right to expect from our local government. Let's insist the city get that right before it worries about the cleanliness of cabs and drivers. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. While success in growing a company is welcome in Wichita, there are broader issues that affect the rest of the metropolitan area. Well, recently the Wichita City Council extended a property tax abatement for a manufacturing company in Wichita. The tax abatement was granted under the city's Industrial Revenue Bonds program. Now, under this program, no city money is lent to the company, and that's important to know because many people believe the IRB program means that the city is lending money. And stories that you may read in the newspaper or see on television often promote this misunderstanding of the way the IRB program works. Well, instead, the sole reason for the IRB bonds is the accompanying property tax exemption and, in some cases, a sales tax exemption. And at wichitaliberty.org, I have several articles that explain the mechanism of how industrial revenue bonds work. Now, often when the city issues a tax abatement through the IRB program, it's done on a 5+5 basis. That is, the city grants the abatement for 5 years. Then in 5 years, the city conducts an evaluation to determine whether the company met the goals that were agreed to. These goals are usually in the form of creating a certain number of jobs at a certain average salary, and perhaps to make a capital investment of a certain amount. If these goals have been met, and maybe even if the goals have not been met, the tax abatement is extended for another 5 years. Now, in this case, the city documents from 2008 estimate the company will avoid paying $239,000 in property taxes for the first year. Savings for subsequent years are probably similar. And since the company met the goals of employment, that's a good thing, the City Council extended the tax abatements for another 5 years. Now, the city promoted the success of this company as evidence of the goodness of the city's policies. And it's great that this company has grown, especially during the recent tough economic times. But there are important questions we need to look at, and the city does not address these issues or even acknowledge them in most cases. And perhaps the most important question is this: was this tax abatement necessary for the expansion to proceed? City documents are silent on this question, and at the 2008 council meeting, the necessity of the tax abatement was not mentioned or discussed. So why were the bonds necessary? The company did not lack access to credit, as city documents state the company purchased the bonds itself. So the company either had cash or access to credit. Okay, so was it a question of economic feasibility? Some economic development programs require that the applicant demonstrate the necessity of an incentive. Often the city presents a gap analysis that purportedly shows a gap between available financing and what is necessary to make the project feasible, something like that. But no such claim was made for this project. Okay, perhaps this proposed expansion just barely missed being economically feasible, and if the company could avoid paying the same property taxes that most everyone else pays, the project would be feasible. But this argument was not advanced. And if it had been, then we would be stuck with the question of why are Wichita property taxes so high that investments like this are not feasible? Or are there other companies that could benefit from these property tax forgiveness programs? Can we identify these companies? Consider all the Wichita companies that go out of business. If we abated their taxes, could they then have survived? Well, the city presents a benefit-to-cost ratio showing that by giving up some property taxes, it gains even more tax revenue from other sources. But a positive benefit-to-cost ratio like this is not remarkable. Any economic activity generally spawns more economic activity, which government then taxes. The question is, did the city, county, school district, and state need to give up tax revenues in order to make this investment possible? Yeah, that's right. The action by the city unilaterally affected 3 other jurisdictions. Well, but no one made that argument. So we need to ask, could we tax this company just like we tax almost all other companies, and then use this tax revenue for something else, like reducing taxes for everyone? Well, part of this company's investment, along with the accompanying risk, is spread to a class of business firms that cannot afford additional cost and risk. These are young startup firms, the entrepreneurial firms that we need to nurture in order to have real and sustainable economic growth and jobs. But we can't identify which young startup firms will be successful. So we need an economic development strategy that creates an environment where young entrepreneurial startup firms have the greatest chance and opportunity to survive. But the actions the Wichita City Council routinely takes works against these young startup firms. Well, a major reason why this action is harmful to the Wichita economy is its strangling effect on these young startup companies. As this company and others escape paying taxes, others have to pay. This increases the burden of the cost of government on everyone else, in particular on the companies that we need to nurture. I do want to distinguish between small business and young business firms. We often hear that small business is the driver of the American economy and job creation. But it's really not the size, it's the age of the firm that is important. Because many small business firms are small by choice and happy to be small. They are not looking to grow and add jobs. You might think of a doctor in solo practice employing perhaps a nurse and a clerk. Doctors who are happy with this mode of practice aren't looking to add more doctors and staff. And there are many small business firms that are in this position. This is not bad. It's good if that's what these businesses want. But it does mean that this medical office is not going to be an engine of job creation. The Kauffman Foundation thinks a lot about these issues and conducts research. Kauffman found that it is new and young companies that are the primary source of job creation in the American economy. These firms also contribute to economic dynamism by injecting competition into markets and spurring innovation. Kauffman also says that many young firms exhibit an up or out dynamic, in which innovative and successful firms grow rapidly and become a wellspring of jobs and economic growth. Well, it's either that or they quickly fail and exit the market, allowing capital to be put to more productive uses. Now, failure is not a pleasant experience, but if we are to have a dynamic economy at the national or local level, we have to put scarce capital to its best and most productive use. Okay, so have you heard Kansas and Wichita politicians, bureaucrats, and civic leaders talk about the difference between small business and young business firms? I haven't, and I think that's a problem. It's a problem because tax incentives, which are a central tool of economic development, do not appear to be designed to help young companies. They are almost entirely skewed towards existing firms, particularly large ones. You may be aware, for example, that Kansas has eliminated income taxes for certain forms of business organization, including a form that most young business firms use. But the Kauffman Foundation tells us that income taxes are often less of an issue than employment and property taxes. Now, employment taxes are the Social Security and Medicare taxes, which are federal issues that are uniform across the country. But property taxes are set at the state and local levels. And in Wichita, our property taxes for industrial property are about average compared to the nation, but our commercial property taxes are very high. This is something we could work on. And related to this is that Wichita relies on targeted investment in companies as an economic development strategy. Our elected officials and bureaucrats believe they have the ability to select which companies are worthy of public investment and which are not. This is a form of centralized planning by government that attempts to shape the future direction of the Wichita economy. But these targeted economic development efforts often usually fail for several reasons. First is the knowledge problem, in that government simply does not know which young firms are worthy of public investment. Remember, young startup firms are the dynamic engine of growth, but at a high risk of failure. If people could predict which young firms would succeed, they could be very wealthy. If a city government could predict which young firms would succeed, we could have widespread, fantastic economic growth and shared prosperity. So it's very difficult to predict the future prospects of young startup firms. Most fail. Some fail spectacularly. Anyone investing this way must be prepared to accept these failures. But with one big success, or perhaps several modest successes, you can become wealthy. If a city government could do this, the city and its people could prosper. But we just don't know which firms we should invest. This lack of knowledge, however, does not stop governments from awarding incentives. And this active investor approach to economic development is what has led to companies receiving subsidies or escaping hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes that others then have to pay. This has a harmful effect on other businesses, both existing firms and those that wish to form. Young and entrepreneurial startup companies are particularly vulnerable. And there's something else to consider. When people invest their own money in a startup firm and it fails, well, that's too bad. And we may be relieved that we did not invest our own money. But it was their own money that these people invested, and presumably they invested voluntarily. But when government invests, it is our money. And when there are failures, people don't like it. They wonder how politicians and bureaucrats could be so stupid with our money. And this has to have an effect on the behavior of government. So what should we do? Well, Dr. Art Hall at Kansas University has studied dynamism and its impact on the economy. He wrote, generally speaking, dynamism represents persistent annual change in about 1/3 of Kansas jobs. Job creation may be a key goal of economic development policy, but job creation is a residual economic outcome of business dynamism. The policy challenge centers on promoting dynamism by establishing a business environment that induces business birth and expansion without bias related to the size or type of business. Well, that means we need to stop worrying so much about creating jobs. Instead, we need to create an environment where companies have the best possible chance to thrive. We need many young startup firms and be prepared to accept the failure of most. This is a dynamic economy that will bring jobs and prosperity. But Wichita does the opposite. Our policies, yes, they are biased towards businesses of a certain size or type. Instead of promoting dynamism, we rely on centralized planning. These plans are being developed right now. We need to move away from economic development based on this active investor, centrally planned approach, especially the policies that prop up our established companies at the detriment of dynamism. We need to advocate for policies at Wichita City Hall, the Sedgwick County Commission, and the state of Kansas that lead to sustainable economic development. We need political leaders who have the wisdom to realize this and the courage to act appropriately, which is to say, to refrain from acting in most circumstances. But that is something that is just not in the DNA of most politicians and bureaucrats.